Okay, everyone, I guess you should now know that you're being recorded, for this event will be disseminated obviously outside the live event, but thank you for joining us. So my name is Dr. Todd May, and I'm going to do a short introduction on the topic, introduce our panel, and talk about just a few housekeeping rules, as it were, some ground rules about how this talk is going to work. So why don't we get underway? So the future of money. Money is a broad topic whose understanding suffers from a lot of mythology and misconception. Most prevalent of these is perhaps the idea that money was introduced as a way to solve the problem of barter, which suffers from the limitation of requiring the coincidence of needs. You can't just barter with anyone. They have to want what you have to offer. You'll find countless scholars and academics averring that money was introduced to solve this problem. Closer scrutiny reveals that this was not the historical case at all. Archaic and ancient societies didn't rely on barter, but different systems of trust and credit underwritten by normative values and precepts. Barter was but a small aspect of ancient economies. Bearing this in mind, one question about money is, what effect does it have on relations of trust? Money facilitates trade and the circulation of wealth, but it has an odd effect insofar as one really doesn't need to know the other person with whom one is trading. Perhaps nothing more than the recent banking crisis with Silicon Valley Bank has brought about concerns about the function of money and the future of money to the foreground. And with the emergence of digital currencies and cryptocurrencies, the role of governing authorities who oversee and enforce trade relations is changing. Oddly, each form of technological currency has a different effect. Digital currencies are issued by central banks and provide centralized governments an unprecedented kind of control over its citizens. Cryptocurrencies are decentralized and remove the need for authorities. They are trustless. With that brief snapshot of the history of money, we are perhaps in a better position to ask and answer, so what is the future of money? To help us find some answers and insights, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. Galit Wilner is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Holon Institute of Technology in Israel. Her research is in philosophy of technology, phenomenology, and fintech. Galit has numerous publications in post-phenomenology, most recent of which is an edited book entitled Post-Phenomenology and Media, Essays on Human-Media World Relations. Jason Mayer is a teacher in mathematics and the author of the forthcoming book, Bitcoin Progressive. He's been interviewed widely on many podcasts and is well known as a public figure on the cryptocurrency education front. Sebastian Purcell is Associate Professor of Philosophy at SUNY Cortland in the US. He is also a cryptocurrency influencer and the Chief Investment Officer at the hedge fund 1.2 Capital Management. Sebastian has forthcoming books on Aztec philosophy with Norton and has published widely in hermeneutics, ethics, and political philosophy. Galit, Jason, and Sebastian, welcome. So,
Hello.
the format for our event today will begin with 45 minutes of discussion amongst the panelists, after which the floor will be open to contributions from our guests. At that time, please feel free to use the chat function in Zoom, and I will try to the best of my ability to get to each question. In the meanwhile, I'd like to remind our audience to leave your microphones muted. And one last note, this event is hosted by Hermeneutics in Real Life. I've not framed my questions for our panelists specifically in mind of hermeneutics, so let me just say this. If we understand hermeneutics as a practice of applying skills of interpretation, the question of the future of money is certainly one that enlists trying to interpret how a curious medium representing value actually operates in our lives. Having said that, let's get things started. So I'd like to open things with a question regarding misunderstandings about money. And I've mentioned that one of the biggest misunderstandings is with respect to barter, which is a historical circumstance. And I'd like to ask each of the panelists, are there any misunderstandings that you'd like to highlight before we enter into a more substantial discussion about money? And Galit, why don't we begin with you?
Thanks a lot, Todd. Thanks for organizing this. I'm really happy to be here. I'm very honored. I'm thinking about scarcity. Scarcity seems to be essential feature of money. Gold was scarce, or so it was considered. But then I would like to highlight some imbalances. Let's say you're Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. You don't feel the scarcity of money. We feel the scarcity of money, right? But some people, they don't. And this imbalance bothered me a lot. And now with the advent of digital currencies, I'm thinking that into Bitcoin, it was programmed, or an attempt to program. First 21 million, now 42. But it's an artificial scarcity that is built into at least some of them. And I'm wondering, what does it mean? Do we need that? Is it necessary? And I think it's similar to the question of barter that you beautifully presented just now, which is something to think about. Do we really need it?
Great, thank you, Galit. So scarcity of money is a huge topic. And yes, I definitely feel the scarcity of money, as I'm sure many of our guests do today. Let's move to Jason. Jason, are there any misunderstandings about money you would like to highlight?
I mean, we can get into a lot of different things throughout the course of the conversation. I think the number one sort of misunderstanding I get from people when I just have conversations about money is that it needs to be, like, by definition, needs to be administered by a government or created by a government and provided by a central authority, which is not true. That's not the historical definition of money. Certainly over the last several hundred years, that's been the case, but it's not necessarily true. And it's not necessarily, doesn't fit the definition of money. So one of the things that people push back on me against is that misconception, is that that at this point, certainly in our history, the relationship between government and money is so intertwined that it's difficult for people who haven't thought about it deeply to untangle them. Certainly, I just want to mention that the 21 million cap on Bitcoin is still exists. It's not 42. It's definitely 21. And we can talk more about scarcity later too. I think that's important. But that would be my contribution to the misunderstandings of money.
Great, thank you, Jason. Yes, scarcity and economics seem to go hand in hand, at least in certain variations that you find in the history of economic thought. Moving on to Sebastian, your turn, please.
Yeah, thanks for organizing this, Todd, and everyone else. I guess I had a couple of thoughts. One of them sort of turns on the role of sovereign currencies in our current monetary system, right? And this is sort of in relation to what Jason just noted. To my mind, it's become increasingly clear that any form of the discussions around money, and this is a controversial statement, but the discussions around money typically turn on where we put our faith. And I think that is a misconception, right? Do you put your faith in a government? Do you put your faith in a mathematical cryptocurrency like algo or something like that? Or do you put it in like the scarcity of the availability of gold or whatever is a medium for exchange? And I think the discussion about where we put our faith is sort of a red herring. To my mind, things, now you could have money in a broader sense, but usable money that we have now in our world has to make sense insofar as you have somebody who can back it up. So if I go to a convenience store, for example, and I decide I'm going to get a Snickers bar and I just don't want to pay for it, I'm just going to take it and leave the store. Okay. I can declare something like, well, it doesn't matter. These slips of paper just dyed green cellulose. Why do you even want them? Right. And so the thing about that is that our monetary system works in that scenario because the store clerk can make a claim with established institutions to invoke a sort of coercive state power apparatus to force me to pay in some form. If I don't want to do it with slips of paper, then I can do it in some other form. And that is coercive power that is at root there, or at work in backing up that kind of money, not faith. That's what I want to point out. It's not faith, it's which institutional systems exist with an organized set of coercive power to force people to act in certain ways. And globally, it's more brutal, right? It's which nation states typically have the most money sort of rule and dictate what happens. It's realpolitik at a global level, it really is, right? And if you don't have nukes or whatever else, then you're at a comparatively lower standard for bargaining at the international level. So it really does come down to straight up coercive power at a global level. And that is what is backing up our financial system. So I'm not making a really general claim, like in all cases, money must be backed up this way or something like that. I'm making a specific claim right now. The way our money works is that it works through systems of institutionalized coercive power. All right. I'm not saying that's a just system or anything else. I'm just saying that is how it works. And it's not about faith. It's about who has power. And I think for me as a fund manager, that's why I'm looking at what happened after the collapse of SVB and related firms. A lot of people ended up actually putting their money into Bitcoin as sort of a hedge against bank collapse. That's what happened over the last week, which I find to be sort of odd. In some form, I think Bitcoin is getting introduced into our existing financial systems, which means that it's being backed up progressively by state forms of coercive power. And that is not that that was the intention or part of the technological function of Bitcoin, but just how it is actually working in our global monetary system. And I think that that's what's giving it sort of the value that it's seeing. In any case, so my main misconception is just people talk about faith. I want to talk about power because I think power is what forces people to recognize that money has value, right?
Thank you, Sebastian. So I'm going to come back to this issue of whether or not a government is necessary to have a system of fungible currency, or world reserve currency, or whatever it might be. Let me give a little bit more historical context in relation to barter, because I think that's a real interesting contrast, or what took the place of what actually existed in ancient and archaic societies. As I said, my information, just for full disclosure, comes from the late David Graeber in his book on debt, and also from a very much underappreciated political economist from the Victorian era named Henry George. He's not liked because he takes a very moral stance about certain economic issues. But notwithstanding that, they both point out, and I don't think Graeber ever read Henry George, that they both point out that if you look at ancient archaic societies, it's built on trust, a very normative system. So just to throw up a contrast to what Sebastian described, you have you don't have a system of coercion by power or authority, but you do have a system, a normative system, which encourages or nudges people to act in certain ways, or as John Stuart Mill would say, would set a familiar pattern of behavior that we can expect. So when you're trading with somebody within that kind of system, it's not that you're just trading a currency or a form of currency, whatever it might be. You're actually trading on your normative social status that you have. So any attempt to renege on the transaction or become a counterparty risk would actually take away from your larger normative cultural standing, which back then at least had much more significance than simply having a lot of whatever it may be in a financial increment. Okay, so there's hopefully an interesting contrast. I'm not requiring the panels to respond to that historical contrast, but just to throw something up as a point of reference. But let's now return to the panelists to see what your further thoughts are about the role of either coercion power, government, whatever it might be, in terms of a monetary policy, whether it's just locally within a society, or if you want to think broadly within a globalized world and the world reserve currency. And you can bring in Bretton Woods or whatever you want. So the floor is yours. Does anyone want to start us off? Jason, got it?
I mean, I can start. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Sebastian said. I think that a lot of the privilege that the United States dollar has right now as a world reserve currency stems directly from coercion and power, and the United States being in a position to leverage both the economic and the military power that they have to protect the status of the United States dollar. I think that most people who don't study economic systems in that way would not realize that necessarily. I think they leverage their influence within world institutions like the IMF and the World Bank to further their control over the monetary, the global monetary system. So in a global sense, I think that's true. And I think that it has devastating consequences if we want to get into specifics of, just the actions over the last 50 years that the United States has taken, by dismantling Bretton Woods and, invoking this petrodollar system in the 70s and through today, what we see around the world as sort of the solidification of this monetary system that people are forced to buy into and to use. And not, not to say that it's all necessarily for like universally bad either. A lot of good things come from from the United States role in the world affairs. I think that the United States dollar as a form of currency is, it's often referred to as the cleanest dirty shirt, right? So there's lots of good that can come from using the dollar. But I think it's right. I think that throughout the span of sort of recorded history, people have chosen to use the best medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account for their monetary technology. And it is only through coercion that somebody would choose something that is inferior, right? So the fact that I cannot steal a Snickers bar and I need to pay with a US dollar and the government will come and point a gun at me is one of the reasons that I use US dollars, right, in my everyday life, even though if we check mark the functions of money and the properties that make good money, that's not necessarily the best one that exists anymore. And I'll just say, I think that to your point, the historical point about this transition away from sort of local communities and economies being based on trust and relationships and social status and those kinds of things, the advent of money in that context was a transition away from that. And, a good money is money that is for enemies, right? Like you can trade with somebody, even though you don't necessarily have to trust them to do that. You don't need to trust that the monetary technology that you're exchanging, there doesn't need to be any trust there. So, a good money is precisely, money for enemies. If you want to think about what makes a good monetary technology, because we've moved past the sort of, local community, sort of like debt-based, credit-based, social-based, forms of economy. So it's a lot of different thoughts that I just scrambled in there. So.
Thank you, Jason. Gal, I'm going to ask you a question and I'm going to try and preface it with some other thoughts, but you don't have to respond to those because I'm trying to make some connections here between the idea of scarcity that you raised at the beginning and this idea of trustlessness that money does introduce. You don't have to trust somebody as long as you can trust the currency. And it seems like, according to the picture we've been presenting, we're trusting the currency because, well, we were kind of coerced in some explicit or inexplicit way to trust the currency. Now, there seems to be something about the relationship between, is scarcity a form of coercion? Is somehow the person who has authority over the money and can control, I guess, the supply of money, maybe that's too simplistic, has a way of enforcing the scarcity? These are very general thoughts. I'm thinking off the top of my head. So a lot of people were very critical of the fact how the US government and the Fed stepped in to save Silicon Valley Bank beyond the insured $250,000 for depositors. And the way they did this was they just extended the FDIC policy from other banks to support that. And it's sort of like, well, that's a way of kind of controlling the money supply. It's a way of controlling the scarcity. It's saying to the people of that bank and the depositors, you're not going to be as quote unquote scarce. We're going to make you whole. We're going to indemnify you in some way, to use insurance language. So there seems to be a lot going on with that. Again, you don't have to respond to that. Those are just some things I want to kind of try and weave in relation to this larger larger
I
picture.
agree with you that scarcity and power, they go together, and they go together beautifully. But this is something that is so 20th century. And when I'm looking into the future, I'm trying to see something a bit different forms of power, different forms of maybe no scarcity. I'm trying to think what it will look like. And I'm not sure that, we are sure that you must have power, you must have this coercive power. That's how the US managed to get the US dollar to become so dominant after the Second World War. But what it's going to be like in 50 years from now, I'm not sure this is the path that we should follow. I'm trying to think as if, I'm a medieval person and someone would come up and tell me, no church, you don't need to go to the church. And people would say, wow, no way. I can't imagine that. And what I'm trying to make us understand is, let's try to imagine that. Okay, there's no scarcity and there's no power. Or it's a different form of power instead of military power. And one of the first steps in this direction for me was with the euro. And this is everybody hates the euro, and it's there are so many examples. Yeah, it's nothing. Let's abolish it. But I think as an attempt, it had something, and it has some kind of interesting inspirations of how we can move forward, building on something different than military power. In a deep sense, sometimes it goes there to this 20th century direction. But there is a possibility of having it in another way. And this is what I find interesting and intriguing to think about. Not that I have an answer, I don't, but I would really like to, to push forward to that direction.
So behind the euro was more of this idea of a solidarity and bringing together of European nations. And that's
Instead of
interesting to
war,
think about. Yeah, to think about a different motivation behind money, besides what we're used to. And I don't want this discussion is not going to turn into an education about cryptocurrency. Those questions can maybe come up in the time afterwards if anyone wants some clarity. We have experts on cryptocurrency, everything you need to know about cryptocurrency, and have been probably told wrong otherwise. But I want to turn a little bit now towards this ethos of what might replace, if we're accurate in describing coercion and this relation to scarcity, what might replace that? I just want to give another historical segue, give some credit to Robert Heilbronner, who's a Marxist, former Marxist philosopher, economist, who said, hey, capitalists, if you think that the government's not involved in your system of economics, you're wrong, because it relies on the US government to enforce relations that create stability throughout the world, and it's, and the world reserve currency and so forth. Now, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, in particular, was originally designed by this person called Satoshi, no one knows who he is, to avoid the use of centralized authority that can force certain relations. And whether or not it can do that, whether or not it's on that path are huge questions. I mean, things are unfolding as they are. And I know Sebastian has certain views about its potential and the hiccups and dangers that can occur. So Sebastian, can you just speak a little bit towards maybe the theme we're talking about at coercion, and what the different kinds of idealisms that might be involved in the broad spectrum of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And this will just pick up on a couple of the preceding topics. I mean, the way that, just to note, like the history of money in brief, to my mind, and this is an oversimplification, is something to the effect of that you have the honor systems of money, get some sort of violent means of change, which forces those systems into something like the Boolean-based systems that were part of what we call the mercantilist economies. Paper money, typically thought to be 1641, first form of it with the Bank of England. Those were war bonds that functioned as paper money at that point. So directly linked to violence, very interesting. And yeah, in some ways, because Jason, you mentioned the link in the petrodollar, like, so clearly Bretton Woods established a whole monetary system with, and a crucial feature of that was the United States setting up more than 830 military camps globally, right? Like, we're everywhere. And that's part of the deal. It's expensive. Like, the only reason we even thought of stepping back from NATO is it's expensive to hold so much military power globally, and the population gets a little restless. Like, why are we spending all this money on that when we can't even afford Social Security or something like that, right? And so hence the reason the United States started to step away from NATO, because it didn't seem like we had an immediate threat against Russia or whatever that we used to have. When it comes to cryptos, and I guess this is going to the future point, I actually don't think that cryptos, and Jason, you and I may disagree on this or maybe not. I think it's really the level of disagreement, not the statements themselves. I don't think that Bitcoin itself is the revolution in money in this kind of like trajectory here, right? I don't think it changes anything. I think ultimately it'll be valuable insofar as it has some form of coercive power to back it up. I'd like to distinguish two kinds of power here, just to be really clear. Coercive power, as auctoritas in Latin, and power to do something, capacitas, right? Something like that. That's really what I want, or potentia, one of those. So power as the ability to do something is a kind of power, and I think we're all right with that. Coercive power is the authoritative form that comes in through institutions, right? This power over, that's auctoritas, versus power to, right? And I ultimately think that money will always, my thesis about money is that it's just unitized power, authoritative power, just unitized power. That's what it is. What matters is the equity, or by which we distribute that unitization, right? That's what the political discussion about justice always was. Nobody ever, the people don't really care that, of course, the state apparatus is authoritative power. The question is, how do we justify or legitimate that power being in the hands of fewer people rather than anyone else, right? And so for me, Bitcoin's approach to decentralization is a novel approach to the question of equity, not so much the question of money, right? So it's trying to get around, rather than trying to come up with systems of legitimation for centralized authorities, what the approach represents is a way to develop legitimation relative to a decentralized body. So it's because Bitcoin still needs a decentralized group of people that maintain it. It's a living thing in a way. Code lives. I remember talking to other people in my C-suite for the hedge fund, because I run the algorithms. And sometimes they get to the question, well, what is the algo? And the answer is, it doesn't really matter. Algos are always live things. They're like plants. You have to water them and make minor adjustments. It's not like I run a quant fund. It's not like I wrote an algorithm one time and it just runs. That's not how it works. You have to update it. Bitcoin is very similar. Like, they don't like to make lots of updates to Bitcoin, but there still is a decentralized body around it that sustains and maintains it, makes sure that it works as the future goes forward, right? So Ethereum, for me, sort of in the white paper to that, really crystallized the notion with the DAO, the decentralized autonomous organization, right? So in short, the future of money is not so much an innovation in money. It's not like money is getting away from authoritative power or unitized power. It's rather that we're changing the quality of the institutions around or supporting the money that makes the difference. So rather than having one big centralized authority where we have to worry about how they're wielding their power, right? Now we have a decentralized system, right? And I think the arguments for legitimation relative to decentralized systems haven't even been made by philosophers, right? You're not going to be able to read Habermas on that, or Rawls, right? Those things don't exist. And this is where I think some work by philosophers would be useful in some ways, is to think about legitimation through decentralized systems or relative to decentralized systems. But that, for me, is the big innovation. So in short, the technology is important because it enables a decentralization of authoritative power, not in itself. So Jason, I don't know if that's something you would disagree with or not. But in short, I don't think Bitcoin changes the basic claim that ultimately, for something to count as money, it has to be backed up. There has to be an enforceable quality somehow. Some set of institutions has to be able to enforce recognizing its value. So I don't think you get outside of that feature. I just think you can get around, and this is the real insight, you can get around centralizing that enforcement capacity. And hence arguments for legitimating that are very different. And we may have a more equitable future if we think about that. It's not actually what's happening. What's happening is, A16Z is going around Silicon Valley and just buying up everything crypto. But, at least in principle, that's the idea. So that's at least where I would put it.
Jason, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, I think, Sebastian made a lot of very important points. I'll just say, sort of for the record, because this is going to be recorded, that I am a Bitcoin only sort of person. I'm an advocate for Bitcoin as opposed to all other cryptocurrencies. I think that there is a distinct difference. I think decentralization is one of those distinct, very important differences. So I think Sebastian's not wrong in the sense that what we've done is replaced a centralized authority that has control over the money with a more decentralized one. And so I'll speak specifically to Bitcoin. But I would just say that's exactly the point. I think that what you have developed for the first time ever is the ability to transmit value from person to person without a trusted third party or intermediary to get in the way of that. That's distributed and decentralized all over the globe, over tens of thousands of nodes that verify transactions and things like this. It does require a community to update code or to have debates about nuanced arguments. I think that the fact that Bitcoin has sort of this immaculate conception, nobody knows who started it. It's open source code that anybody can validate. Nobody is in charge of it. Nobody can knock on anybody's door and say you need to shut it down. It's not stoppable in any meaningful way, no matter what sort of military or economic powers you throw at it. Those are all very much important. So I'm not a philosopher, and so I can't speak to the idea of legitimizing, through distributed or decentralized, matters from a philosophical sense. But I think that's precisely the point. What we've done is we've given people a way to transact with one another peer-to-peer that doesn't require centralized authority. That's never been done over a network of computers before. And we can see that there's a relationship that people have with storing their own value, taking self-custody of that value in a way that doesn't require a bank necessarily or somebody to watch over your gold or for you to trust somebody else. All of these are innovations compared to the old monetary system, the relationship between banks and government, and all of those things that are really quite interesting and fraught. The whole point is the decentralization has sidestepped all of that and given people the ability to transact with. In this case, a lot of people don't even consider like Bitcoin a currency, but it's a digital cash bearer instrument, final cash settlement instrument where you can transact peer-to-peer without having to trust anybody else. The role of verifying transactions and your ability to instigate a transaction belongs to everybody on the network and nobody on the network. So it can't be censored. There is no gateway to let you in or stop you from entering. And it's open to everybody. So I'd say I don't necessarily disagree with the point that it's about centralization versus decentralization, but I would just say that I think that's a very important point, and I think that's really the crux of the issue and why Bitcoin is able to solve some of the questions that we've been talking about already.
There's kind of an irony emerging here where I often view money just in the general form as a kind of technology. And if we think about it that way, then money in its very basic form as a currency is a technology that allows us to trade without having to trust the other person, because we have some kind of way of trusting the currency itself, whatever that might be, whether it be normative, political authority. And now we're in a position, if we're on the same boat, as it were, of trying to get around centralized authorities, now we're relying on a different form of technology to help the initial technology. I'm not saying that's the right picture, that's what's coming up, but Gallup, maybe you, with your experience with the philosophy of technology and with fintech, and the issues of scarcity raised and trying to find another way in which money can operate and function within a globalized world. How do you see technology involved in that? Is it absolutely essential, or do you have other views about technology being not necessarily essential and could be contingent to something more important?
Well, when I teach fintech, I like to introduce my students with Bruno Latour's notion of delegation. And that's almost banal, I would say, right? There is a delegation of what was the central power of the central banks. It's a delegation to an algorithm. With all Latour's classical examples of the automatic doors and the bumpers, we constantly delegate powers, I would say, yes, powers and authority to technologies. Now, when you delegate it, it's not done automatically, and it's not done in a very clean way. There's always noise around it, and the trick is to recognize the noise around what happens when you do this delegation, when the delegation happens. And I'm thinking again with this issue of power, I really like this direction in this talk. And with this, I'm thinking of the evolution. Well, you know, in evolution, you don't talk about power. You talk about genes. And here I would like to mention the meme, especially the meme stocks and the meme coins like Dogecoin. And the meme logic seems to me like a logic that can explain much more than the logic of power and authority, especially in a decentralized environment. It seems to me something that is powerful in the sense of that it makes me think into constructive directions, instead of thinking in terms of authority and power, Foucault-like. I would appreciate your thoughts on that.
So one of the great things about cryptocurrency memes is that you can invest in a project or a protocol because you like the idea behind it, and then hopefully it relates to some kind of utility being provided, as opposed to I'm going to make 1,000 times of what I invested and watch the coin shoot up. I know there's that problem with it, and there's a larger problem about the cryptocurrency just falling prey to already existing reiterative bad financial behavior. So we can look at Silicon Valley Bank, whatever, in terms of, or FTX, I'm sorry, in terms of that. It wasn't cryptocurrency per se, it was because these people are just acting like other people have been doing throughout history in that position. So that's interesting about cryptocurrency. I'm just noting the time, the 45 minutes I've set aside for this panel discussion has gone by very quickly. Feel free to respond to anything that's been raised in the discussion so far, but I'm going to ask each panelist a question about what your hunch or even worked out view is about the future of money, regardless of whether or not it's pessimistic or optimistic. So why don't we begin with Jason?
So my hunch / worked out view, I have a hope and a fear. I think the fear is that that we have some sort of widespread release and adoption of central bank digital currencies. I think this is sort of a dystopian path. Sort of gives people censorship abilities, put expiration dates on money, limits people's ability to spend certain things on certain times depending on their social score. Those kinds of like horrible things that you can cook up. It just brings us one step closer to all of that. The hope is that instead we develop some sort of monetary policy monetary technology that's based on a hard money asset like Bitcoin that cannot be confiscated, censored, restricted from anybody in the world. I think that if you could imagine a world in 10, 15, 20 years where the global reserve currency is Bitcoin and people can, on an individual basis, hold that, protect it from themselves, take self-custody of it. It helps keep governments and other powerful entities in check, as opposed to something like gold, which can be confiscated and taken. And it can't be printed, you can't make any more of it, and it just sort of limits the power that powerful institutions have. So the fear is that we let central banks try to recreate a version of Bitcoin that they get to control. And the hope is that people adopt a version, either a currency backed by something like Bitcoin or Bitcoin itself, for a more prosperous and abundant future.
Thank you. Sebastian.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess one point that I would just add to what Jason said is an additional worry that I have is not so much central banks taking over currencies, but also the prospect of just our large financial, the SIBs, the JP Morgan, et cetera, taking over stable coins, for example. Existing regulatory pressure is narrowing the scope of who can even issue these coins. And the result is that there's a lot of money to be made on offering stable. So even if it's not the government that's doing it, having JP Morgan own the digital version of the dollar is not any better. I think that's even worse in a lot of cases. So that's just an additional concern here. For me, the real innovation in the crypto space, and this is why I'm not a Bitcoin maxi, I'm a crypto maximalist, is it really comes with decentralizing the institutions around financial exchange. So for me, it's the smart contract that matters, because when you have a DAO that runs on a smart contract, just as Bitcoin has a community that supports it, the thing is the community that supports it itself doesn't operate by an open system of rules that are coded into something in a trustless way. But that's what a DAO is an open system of rules that are coded into a system using a smart contract. That's exactly what that does, right? And so for me, you have to not only have the coin work at that level, you have to have the institution that supports the coin work at that level. And that's what the DAO does. That's why I like smart contracts, and Bitcoin might end up doing that anyway with stacks or whatever else. Like there's a way for Bitcoin to do that if they wanted. But I'm just saying right now they're not, but they could. And so decentralized autonomous organizations for me are the future. Why? Because there's a way in which they automate away centralized authority. So if these run correctly, okay, in order for this to transpire, first of all, we need different regulations. We need something like the SEC to carve out an exemption path like they did with Reg D for hedge funds or whatever else, okay? There should be some path where we just call all these things, sure, they're securities, fine, just call them securities, but they have a regulatory path where they have to start out centralized and they get so many years to become decentralized, right? You apply for an exemption and then you follow up on that exemption path. And then once you hit certain standards, you need to be decentralized. That makes the most sense to me. It keeps investors safe and it allows decentralized projects to actually be decentralized. Under that scenario, these really are securities. People can just start issuing them. And if you got, like, for example, imagine a decentralized version of Uber. What Uber wanted to do was buy a bunch of fully automated cars from Tesla, right? And just get rid of all the drivers. So that's traditional automation, is to they automate away the periphery, all of the people who are doing the work, right? But decentralization with a DAO, it automates away the center. Nobody owns it, right? There's no C-suite. There's no owners in the middle taking all of that. Instead, what you just have is every driver gets the full amount of the transaction minus each payment minus the transaction fees that keep the system going. And see how that automatically redistributes the money back to people. That's how decentralization can achieve a kind of equity that isn't currently present in our system, right? And it operates a way to achieve a sort of like turning the means of production over to the proletariat or something like that, but not in the way that Marx ever envisioned, right? But it turns out to be a way in which the actual people who make our systems function can get back their fair share. It solves the surplus value problem that Marx identifies, right? Because there's no surplus value going to an owner at the center. It's decentralized. It goes directly back to the people who participate in the system. And that looks like a solution to me, like the hopeful solution in the future, because in large part, otherwise what we're going to get is a lot of robots automating away humans. And it's going to be a problem. I mean, we can just see that coming forward, probably to sustain kind of population declines in countries like China and most of Europe, et cetera. We'll get a lot more automation, right? But right now, under the present system, the owners of that automation will get all of the money. But if they were decentralized, then the participant owners, you could just buy, you know, per share ownership in some robot farm, right? And then you would just get money back for that, right? You can already do that with the decentralized systems. And that also gives us a way to think of a universal basic income, but without going through the state. Typical proposals for universal basic income are, okay, we're making so much money, everyone, the national government now gives everyone $1,000 a month or something like that. Instead, what happens with these systems is that by participating in a DAO, money is already redistributed back to people immediately. So it is like Ubi, but it's Ubi without a state authority running Ubi, right? So it's a completely different version of that. And that's the hopeful path. That for me is the hopeful path. Is it solves a bunch of problems. It turns out to be quasi-leftist, but not really. It's also quasi-libertarian because it's getting rid of a lot of state centralized powers. There's a weird mix of the two. I don't know what to call that exactly, but that would be my preferred version of the future, at least.
Thank you, Sebastian. Galit, would you like to close our panel discussion with your views on the future of money?
I buy Sebastian's view. I'm fond of cooperatives. There are some cooperative banks, for example, beautiful examples, really, really, and it's something that has been working for some decades, if not more than that. My fear is that with it's a kind of a political problem against these cooperatives. We see the large tech companies. We've seen when Facebook was still Facebook, before it became Meta, they tried to enter the cryptocurrency. Remember that? They had something, yeah, not very successful.
Libra.
But it's a sign. I bet that in Apple, Amazon, Google, they all had, that's a wild guess, yeah, that they had teams working on that, thinking in that direction. And once there is a successful cooperative, they would fight it. And I don't think that in this sphere, we can go for any regulator to save us in that sense. We are seeing that in AI regulation. It's very difficult for regulators to save us. It's almost impossible. I'm now advising the Israeli Ministry of Science on AI regulation and say, oh, but we're so small, we don't have the power. And then you go to larger countries and they still say, oh, but we're so small. It's a state of mind of those regulators. So we need, I don't know which frame, but we need to think how to make sure that we find ourselves with the DAO and cooperative path rather than what we see today. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists before we turn to open discussion with the audience. But thank you, Galit, Jason, and Sebastian. So moving forward to the questions, I think the best thing to do, since we're in spotlighted mode with Zoom, is to put your questions or say, I have a question in the chat box and I can turn to you or ask you to turn on your mic so you can ask the question. And the first one is from Michael Johnson, and it's actually a very good question. So Michael, if you'd like to just talk to your question to present to the panelists, please.
Oh, thank you, the panelists, for this is extremely interesting conversation and My question is from a non-expert point of view, and I'm thinking about the title of the panel, "The Future of Money." Is there a kind of utopian aspect to this question? And so I'll just read my question because I tried to think it out before I'm asking it here. I would like to ask the experts, is the value of Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in some sense parasitic on the larger economy and state forms of coercive power, as Sebastian was suggesting, or alternately trust? And today this depends on the global digital currency exchange systems between banks and national currency, the world exchange currency Bretton Woods systems, or could Bitcoin or something like it become the global exchange currency itself? Now, I think this question was kind of just answered by each of the panelists, but I want to push it to that ultimate question, right? Would it ever be possible for other non-blockchain transactions based on sovereign currencies to wither away completely and be replaced by cryptocurrency transactions alone? In other words, is cryptocurrency truly a decentralized system, or is it or is it still in some sense relatively decentralized, but still dependent on the larger geopolitical system? If Bitcoin then does become the new state system, or new system rather, would it become the new center of power and privilege? I hope that makes sense as a question.
Great, thank you, Michael. Jason, would you like to begin?
I'm sure. I think I'll try to answer the parts of the question I understand the most. It is my feeling, it is definitely my belief that Bitcoin can become Bitcoin replaces sort of the unit of exchange from peer-to-peer transactions. It also has a potential to replace monetary policy from central banks, which is all sort of embedded. It has the chance to replace the global reserve currency and facilitate moving value across the globe at the speed of light with essentially no fees. All of that's possible. Is that going to happen within my lifetime? If it does happen within my lifetime, it's not going to come with a lot of other pain. The real question is, the pain is going to happen one way or the other. I think that the current system that we have is based on sort of American sovereign debt and America's willingness to go out and defend that monetary system with war and coercion. And it's all based on sort of a growing, no matter what, growing economy to sort of sustain that debt. None of that's really possible within a pure Bitcoin system. And so at some point, that sort of debt spiral is going to catch up with us one way or the other. I can maybe hope that people get on board before that happens, so it's not as painful. But the answer to the last part, which is, doesn't Bitcoin become the new center of power and privilege? Well, people in that world, people who have access to Bitcoin certainly will have power and influence, but there is nobody in charge of the system. It's not as if we can talk to Jerome Powell or Janet Yellen or the people who came up with Bretton Woods or Richard Nixon who dismantled it and point a finger towards any one specific person. This is a completely decentralized. I mean, among cryptocurrencies generally, it's the most decentralized. And there are policies and procedures in place. That decentralization means that when adjustments or edits or changes happen, it happens in a consensus sort of way within the system. So the idea of what power and the centralization of power and privilege mean looks a lot different in that vision of the world. It doesn't look like it looks now. So it's impossible to answer, but it certainly doesn't look like, the Fed deciding to raise interest rates until the bank, crumbles, right? It doesn't look like that anymore. It looks like something else probably.
Thank you. Sebastian Gallup, did you want to respond to that? You don't have to, but.
It's just, I always have this little fear that a person or a group of persons might get majority in this decentralized system. That's my fear. I don't know whether it's logical or not, but I'm really scared, and I don't think that there are any mechanisms to prevent that, as much as I know. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
I suppose it would be a version of a Sybil attack in some way. So maybe Sebastian, you can
Yeah.
speak to what that is and in relation to that.
Yeah. Yeah, just, I mean, and I'm sure Jason could too, in terms of like the full complexity, but for most of these blockchains, the way the consensus mechanisms work is if for whatever reason you happen to own 51% or more of the coins, or whatever's doing the validating on the network, you can rewrite the blockchain. Okay. Now you would be incentivized not to, because you would people would then lose trust in the system. And since it costs a lot of money to buy more than half the system, you are sort of by definition going to be in a losing position. You're going to end up, there's no way to game this so that you end up with more by manipulating it, right? But you know, if somebody wanted out of just purely malicious means, like that is a possibility, right? If they're just a bad actor and they see this as a form of like financial terrorism or something like that, then maybe that is a concern, right? To my mind, Michael, I actually think that we're seeing the future of money, and it is rafted on a sovereign system. It's always going to be layers. They're all layers, and the way tech works for me is through layers, right? We're communicating via Zoom, which itself, you know, we got to this probably through some sense of email, which works through a whole series of protocols. Back in my day when I used to do a lot more coding and I was a kid, and, you know, I learned a lot about TCP/IP protocols and those sorts of things, and nobody even talks about that stuff, right? It's just layers and layers of technology on top of technology, and that's what makes things usable. I think that's actually what we're getting with money, is that we are going to have this set of stuff at a certain level, but then you're going to layer on this other stuff too. And I don't ever see it not being parasitical, because at the end of the day, I do think it's going to come down to somebody, you know, the other way to say money is unitized power is to say the value of money is blood and bullets. Okay, that's what it is. At some point, money is founded on blood and bullets. Somebody's going to shoot somebody else for not doing the thing that we wanted them to do. It's what it comes down to. And that will always require state apparatus. That's why I don't think we're getting rid of it. No withering away of the state with this stuff. But I do think that we're sort of outsourcing some of the aspects of the state. So we are decentralizing some of that state apparatus, and that's useful, right? And these decentralized systems hold out the prospect of being more just, but, you know, maybe not. Maybe it'll just be JP Morgan and A16Z. A16Z, for those of you who don't know, is one of the largest venture firms in the space. So that's Andreessen Horowitz. They're just out there buying all of this stuff. So maybe it's just some weird dystopian version of society where the corpos own everything, right? Like that's a concern there. But yeah, I mean, there would be then the problem, to my mind, if Bitcoin just like takes over everything. Those of us who are in early and own a bunch of Bitcoin, oh my goodness, are we going to have a lot of power in that system? Like I do worry a little bit about that, right? Like, so I mean, I run a hedge fund, so I would conceivably be in charge of a whole lot of power. Not that I want it, right? But you know, that's a system that it does bug me, actually, and I don't know quite what to do about that.
So I just want to just tack on really quickly to Gallett's concern, which is like just about the so-called 51% attack. Like, can there be a small group of people? And I just say, if this is something you worry about, Bitcoiners worry about this 10 times as much as you do, right? This is something we talk about all the time. And this is why, I mean, you know, I don't want to get into like the Bitcoin versus the rest of crypto. I mean, the amount of computing power you would need to do that on Bitcoin right now doesn't exist. It physically doesn't exist, and you couldn't buy it, right? Like, it just doesn't happen. It's so decentralized and so distributed around the world that you couldn't, even if you had the money to do it, you couldn't purchase the hardware to actually run a 51% attack on Bitcoin. And that's why, you know, proof of work and Bitcoin is so important. Like, it protects the ledger and it keeps it from being, you know, taken over. So it's not impossible in the sense of like a theoretical concern, but this is, you know, first and foremost, like one of the very things that people worry about in the Bitcoin community. And we talk about it, and we sort of understand that this is one possible way. You know, I think that a much more likely way to like break down Bitcoin is to sort of just, you know, cancel all of the on-ramps and don't let people use their bank accounts to buy Bitcoin, right? Like that's the more pressing concern if you want to think about attack vectors for Bitcoin. Certainly the 51% attack is like a known thing, and it's certainly something that is taken very seriously within the community, and I'm sure it is with other cryptocurrencies too, but certainly none of them are as large and as distributed and as robust as Bitcoin's mechanism for securing the blockchain.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next question, which is presented by Jay. I'll read this out, and it's on a point of education. How do we reduce the complexity of understanding the benefits of Bitcoin? I find in general conversations with people I know, many simply don't understand what the possibilities of a decentralized currency actually means. This is a problem of education, and we need to simplify this. So any suggestions from our panelists about this? I believe this might speak to a little bit about the technology adoption threshold, where, you know, technology just won't stick until it crosses a certain threshold, as it were.
I mean, I can speak a little bit to this insofar as it's a sort of a daily thing for me, speaking with investors, right? So we get a lot of skepticism, and typically this goes through stages. Some of the easy things to, I guess it's easier in my experience to talk to people about pain points in the existing system, and then showing where cryptocurrencies of some form could help that out. So, you know, the unbanked is a problem that's just a general problem, right? People would need to store their money somewhere. You get the right wallet, and with a cryptocurrency, it takes you a few minutes. Most people do have access to a phone, even in Africa, South Pacific, large areas of Latin America, and you can just store your cryptos there. And it's not, you know, people who suffer, like Argentina right now has like better than 100% inflation on the year, right? So this gives you an alternative way to store your money. People, you know, worry. So Bitcoin is down like now, I think about 63% from its all-time high. People say that it's not a store of value. It's like, well, relative to what kind of currency, right? That argument really assumes a lot of privilege there. It's not a store of value relative to the US dollar, meaning that you're an American, right? Like, so when you say these things don't have use cases, you're not looking at it from the right point of view. So that's like the unbanked system. And by the way, I forget how many millions of Americans themselves are unbanked. So this is not just like, you know, southern part of the globe problem. This is a large problem that way. You know, we all right now, our money goes to Visa and those sorts of things. There are all kinds of settlement problems, issues like that. I have to deal with this for my newsletter subscribers. There's a paid portion of that. So they have to go through PayPal, not other kinds of systems. Stripe doesn't like cryptos, like they say they do, but they don't, and they'll just like demonetize you. So protections from various just whims in our system, right? Or how long it takes and how much money it costs to transfer things. All of that can be solved by cryptos. I can even defend NFTs this way. You know, I have a bit of art behind me. I don't know what that is, but probably I could come up with a better piece of art through, you know, Midjourney and AI in about 3 minutes. But the point is that if you're an artist, your art gets sold once, right? If you're not known and somebody comes by and picks up your art on the cheap, and then you make it later on and your pieces sell for millions of dollars as an artist, you don't get a cut of that later on. It's just gone. But with NFT art, there's a permanent royalty system that you could build into that. So if you're a starting artist and you do become well known, then and your art gets sold for millions later on, you get a permanent royalty from each sale. So this is a way to make the sale and resale of art equitable again. Notice how these are, in any case, that's my general approach, is to find pain points like that and to say, like, see, here's how those stupid monkey JPEGs are actually useful. there's a real transformation that's going on here, and it does matter, even if you don't like monkey JPEGs. There's something going on here that does matter for some people, and just because it doesn't immediately intersect with you doesn't mean that there isn't a large demographic of people who care about that. So the general explanation for the value of cryptos, I find is not to explain it generally, just to find pain points here, here, and here, and then say like, hey, we could solve these this way. That's the approach that I use, since I do have to kind of weekly-ish talk to people about this.
Jason, I imagine you have a lot to say about this, given your forthcoming book, Bitcoin Progressive.
Yeah.
Do you want to add some insights as well?
Yeah, I mean, I started my journey of writing my book precisely for this reason. I found it difficult to interact with people, and I'm a teacher. That's my day job. I teach math, and I was excited when I was able to sort of explain. In my case, I was explain Bitcoin to somebody, and they would have that aha moment that was exciting for me. And I realized that it was difficult for me to do that with a lot of the people that I hang out with and I surround myself with, because there's a reluctance that people just think it's a joke. They don't take it seriously. But the reality is that there's, the book that I'm writing, if you wanted to go to Bitcoin Progressive, just to plug, just to see what it is that comes out in a couple of months, is just precisely what we're talking about, a way to relay the importance of this new technology, this new monetary technology, and the problems that it can solve. Just to Sebastian's point, like, it is difficult sometimes to talk to an American who has a monetary, financial infrastructure that works all the time and convince them that they need something like Bitcoin, when you can go to someplace like Latin America or Africa, and just ask somebody, what's your experience with money like? And they will tell you all of the reasons that they need Bitcoin in their life without realizing it. A majority of the world lives under authoritarian rule, where their money can be seized without due process of law. Their bank accounts are frozen, if they even have bank accounts. It's hard to transmit and costly to transmit money for remittances back home for people in the around the world who want to send money back home. A lot of political opposition gets their bank accounts frozen or seized, and all of this stuff is happening all over the world. Most people on this planet have to deal with this kind of thing. And if it's not that, it might be hyperinflation, where sort of like the economy that you are born into is just destabilized almost overnight and your life savings is wiped out immediately. So all of these things are problems all over the world for most people. Bitcoin, in my view, Bitcoin is a solution, or an avenue towards a solution for all of those things. And the book that I wrote is an attempt to just get people interested in that idea that it's not just this sort of punchline to a joke. It's not just, oh, fake money. It's actually like a real way to transmit value and to secure property rights for billions of people across the world and solve a lot of the problems that some Americans see those problems, but a lot don't. Paul Krugman the other day very, infamously tweeted out how he was having trouble with Venmo. And this is after years and years of giving, Bitcoin such a hard time. It's like, I can't get my Venmo to work. And then he finally, it seemed like my tweet worked. And I figured it out. Well, yeah, you're a highly connected, influential person. And Venmo realized when you tweeted at them, like, they got this stuff to work. That doesn't happen with Bitcoin. You don't get all of a sudden sort of censored either on purpose or by mistake when you're using something like Bitcoin. So most Americans don't usually on a day-to-day have to deal with this, but most people in the world do. And I think that, to Sebastian's point, there is a series of problems that this solves. And if you're not thinking about that day in and day out, that's a form of privilege. And the book that I've written is just an attempt to expose people to those problems and the potential solutions. So.
Thank you. I was reminded of that story when the Ukrainian war first broke out. Every Ukrainians that were fleeing from their country were trying to get cash at the bank, but the lines were so long, and I'm sure there was issues with liquidity. And then there was a story of a teenager who said, I don't think I can go anywhere because I don't have I can't get money out of the bank. And his or her friend, I forgot if it was a man or a woman or a teenager, their friend basically sent them Bitcoin, and he or she was able to use that Bitcoin to get out of the country, I think, to cross to Poland. So that was quite interesting. We're getting some more questions lining up. Gal, did you want to respond to the education question? Okay, so we have I know Brad DeFord, and I know he's going to have a very substantial question, and this is going to draw on some philosophy and hermeneutics. So I will let Brad speak to that question. Brad.
Thank you, Todd. I have to say, given the events of the last 2 weeks and the failures of one bank that was based entirely in Bitcoin and the other one that was in Northern California, Central California, that was simply based on speculative financing. Anyway, given the failure of those two banks and the response of our government, the US government, in bailing everyone out to the tune of whatever billions of dollars they had put in the bank, I thought, surely there must be a better way. And you guys have outlined a better way. So I'm appreciative of everything you said. On the other hand, there are several points I made in my chat, which I'll try to remember. One of them is I'd like to know how, in your frame of ethical reference, recurs 3 parts in oneself as another, as the search for the good life, in community with others, and in just institutions. Those 3 parts seem to me to be defined in a much different way than I take them, and I think maybe Recur took them, and the way you guys talk about it, they exclude lots of people. The who of is and what a good life is, the who of with and for others, and the notion of just systems works well within your frame of reference, but I don't know that it works well for me and for many of us who are in what I would call the lower caste. We who are excluded from the world that you guys are describing are in a different caste than you. So I think this takes some ideology critique. I know there's a word in there somewhere. And but somebody did mention Habermas, so here we go. And then the third part about that is there is, I think, still a country in Central America whose leader, autocrat, is trying to free it from its relationship to the US dollar. So he based his country's economy on Bitcoin and distributed Bitcoin to everyone, every citizen in the country, according to whatever metric he used. And the story was that many people got their Bitcoin distribution and went out and bought McDonald's. Now, that's what I would do. I mean, if you gave me Bitcoin, I'm going to spend it on food because I have no idea how I'm going to move out of my caste into the caste that appreciates Bitcoin economy, even with all the wonderful things you said about decentralization. So basically, that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, anyone like to have a go at that?
I don't want to preempt anyone. I can start the discussion. Yeah, so for Recur, aiming at the good life with and for others in just institutions is an articulation of just a philosophical backdrop, and this is kind of how I understand it. An articulation of the implications of self-directedness or autonomy, right? So if we step all the way back to Immanuel Kant, but you know, who defines autonomy effectively as the basic ethical principle. Aristotle has a notion of self-realization, so I don't want to say this is only in Kant. So it's not only a modern idea, but the idea is to think through what does it mean if each person is able to direct their own lives as they see fit in a way that is coordinated with other people doing that same thing, and in institutions that allow them to do that same thing. So that's why those three parts come from: aiming at the good life, my own thing, with and for others in some sort of community. That's other people doing that in just institutions that supports this whole process. Hegel gives this idea the name mutual recognition. That's what that is in Hegel, right? And if we're honest, we're all modern enough to have bought into a lot of these things. I can point to, that's a move that Charles Taylor makes, the philosopher. He just say things like, look, this is what explains our sense of appropriate norms, how we relate to other people, why why most of us disagree with utilitarian premises, like if one person could be murdered and their organs distributed to save the lives of 5 other people. Most of us say, like, that's still not a good thing, right? And that kind of comes back to Kant in some way, or Aristotle. Now, the quality of the just institutions here that you're talking about, Brad, I think is the problem. Because what I think you're identifying is that in order to gain access to these distributed institutions, a certain level of technological competence proves necessary, so that people who lack that technological competence are shuttered from the system. So even if it's great and it solves a lot of problems, it doesn't solve problems for people who lack that, if I'm understanding you, lack the ability to jump in and do this sort of thing. And I think to some extent, yes, and to some extent, no. That's sort of where that is. Right now, it's true. There is, with, I don't know, Jason, you probably run into this too. It's the UX problem, the user experience problem, the user interface problem. There's no really easy way to get into all of this stuff. Part of what I do for my hedge fund is I run a whole yield farming scheme, which is just miles and miles of complexity running the background system of decentralized networks. Turns out to be extremely profitable, and you can run those, if you know what you're doing, for 20% annualized returns with virtually no risk. But you have to really know what you're doing, and it's not accessible to a lot of people. And probably the peculiarities do involve not only technological competence, but a certain amount of mathematical competence. It gets weird. And so I think that there's this competency-based stratification that you're worried about. And that's probably a true thing. What happens is, though, that people are incentivized. This is going to be my weird answer to that. People are incentivized to come up with solutions to allow people who don't want to spend all of their lives doing this stuff to benefit from the system. See, and we started getting a few of these. One of them that exists right now is this thing called the stake DAO. So like I said, running these decentralized systems allows you to deposit. Basically what happens is that when 2 people want to exchange their coins in a decentralized network, how do they do that? Well, you have to have some pool where people have put those 2 coins and allow them to exchange autonomously. Now, if you deposit your 2 coins in that pool and allow other people to exchange it, you get a cut of every single transaction. So it's kind of like running a toll booth with cryptocurrencies. Okay, so that's effectively what I'm doing at a complex level. Stake DAO kind of just automates that for you. So it lowers the barrier a little bit. You still got to get on the whole network, but once you do, you can just deposit your coins and walk away. Okay, you don't get the same returns that I get, but you get pretty good returns, right? And so their whole premise is to run that for other people, and they make a lot of money doing it. So they're incentivized to do that sort of thing. If you can, in short, there's an economic incentive to allow everyone to who doesn't have the technological competence to get in there. Granted, you still got this riding class of stuff. People are still making money on that, but it's not as if people are shut out. Okay, and so there's a lot of incentive to push to onboard people through more friendly means. We want people to be able to download an app and just say, okay, put my money here, hit a few buttons and walk away. That's what we want. I think we're 5 years from that, roughly. I think we're roughly
Yes.
5 years from that. So that goes to that question. With so that means with and for others in just institutions, in short, just institutions has to imply something about technological barriers that were probably never considered, right? Typically, like my wife who works on disability, she would point out various disability barriers, right, that are a real thing. But I think that this shows increasingly you're just going to get miles of specialization. I used to think that the forms of the crypto world that I do is for everyone, and I realized it's definitely not. It's extremely complicated. It's far more complicated than stocks. It's everything you ever had to know about the traditional finance world, plus a whole bunch of crypto, like cryptography, plus a whole bunch of coding stuff. It's massively more complicated than the previous financial system, massively so. But there, at least the system is incentivized to try to overcome those barriers. And the only thing you have to count on is people being greedy, which for me is something I can probably count on.
Thank you. Mindful of the time, we have about 4 minutes left in our session. I don't know if Galip or Jason want to respond to Brad's comment about caste layering and accessibility to technological solutions to money.
Just an extremely short comment. In philosophy of technology today, at least when I think of ethics of technology, I don't follow the ancients. Hans Jonas described beautifully how the whole ethics is just about me against nature. We've seen how this approach brought us to the poor conditions in which we are now. So what we are trying to build up is a new ethics of technology that is not relying on the subject-object dichotomy, but rather as a cooperation of humans and technologies. It's a different ethics. So recur, to the best of my understanding, belongs to this classical ethics that I don't think is suitable for today's landscape. That's the shortest that I can tell about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Galip. Jason.
And I'll be very quick too. I just want to point out that the to use Bitcoin as money and to transact with another person, if you're able to send an email and to get on a Zoom call, we have that UX right now. We're not 5 years away from that. And if you have money that serves as an actual store of value and money, and you don't need to go out searching for yield or do complicated stuff, those are all options. But certainly, if you just want to send somebody Bitcoin or receive Bitcoin because you just sold them a beer or you're buying a pretzel from them, and you know how to send an email, like that exists right now, today, last year. And just a point of clarification that when El Salvador has made Bitcoin legal tender, it did not replace the dollar. The Bitcoin exists as legal tender alongside the dollar. It should be pointed out that there are 2 countries in the world right now that have accepted Bitcoin as legal tender, both of which suffer under monetary neocolonialism. The other one is Central African Republic. And there are a lot of criticisms in the Bitcoin world about how Bukele actually implemented that, that legal tender law. But it was coupled with a lot of education, and there's a lot of success stories about people using Bitcoin as a way of saving in El Salvador. And there's certainly a lot of examples of El Salvador as a nation leveraging their exposure to Bitcoin and stepping away from sort of the structural agreements that the IMF and the World Bank imposes on them to get sort of like developmental funding and things like that. So they are leveraging their ability on the global stage by using Bitcoin to step away from some of those coercive institutions that we've talked about. So that's, I think, a point of clarification about what's happening in El Salvador. It's not all good, but it's certainly not all just Big Macs. And if you just want to use Bitcoin for money, then it's not hard. If you know how to send an email, you can do the same thing with Bitcoin. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
Thank you, all 3 of you. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. That brings us to a close of this session. If you're interested in future hermeneutics in real life public conversations, please do check out our website at HinRL.org, where we'll have a list. But please join me in thanking our panelists, Scarlett Willner, Jason Mayer, and Sebastian Purcell for a very thorough and enlightening and insightful conversation. And thank you to our audience. That brings us to a close. I'm Dr. Todd May for Hermeneutics in Real Life.